What if everything our nation's massive military complex was really designed to do for the last 20 years? What if it was fundamentally wrong? I mean, for over 2 decades, the U.S. defense establishment was just completely preoccupied with endless nation building, policing conflicts, mostly in the greater Middle East. But, while we were distracted by all these overseas skirmishes, a much bigger threat, fiscal and strategic, was growing right here in our hemisphere. And the cost of that distraction, well, it's becoming undeniable now. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. We're diving into what feels like a critical new strategic reality. It's this urgent shift away from, being the world's sole police force and towards prioritizing the defense of the American homeland. And this is crucial, correcting our frankly unsustainable defense spending habits. Our mission here is to understand the blueprint for this change. It's really a call for strategic restraint. That means demanding fiscal prudence, yeah, but also radical innovation and a clear-eyed view of threats that are, well, literally at our doorstep now.
Right. And that really raises a huge question. Can the U.S. actually pivot that massive institutional shift? I mean, move it away from these endless, really costly wars and towards a more targeted security posture, especially when, you're facing these massive internal fiscal pressures, runaway deficits, and this growing external threat. We're talking about China, which is strategically positioning itself right in our own backyard. So we've synthesized reports here from leading national security think tanks, and they detail everything from the budget pathologies, the weird ways money gets spent that fuel unnecessary spending, to the very real risk of China leveraging assets like ports in the Western Hemisphere against U.S. interests. It really feels like a moment where realism just has to win out over those grand global ambitions.
Yeah. The sources we're looking at, often these are former defense officials writing them. They make it abundantly clear this era of unlimited budgets and endless overseas ops, it hasn't made us stronger. It seems to have created some pretty profound vulnerabilities right here at home.
Okay, so let's start with the money, because the sheer scale of what sources call unnecessary military spending has actually become a national security vulnerability in itself. I mean, consider this fact, it's pretty staggering. Despite the formal end of major ground wars, the winding down of overseas combat, the U.S. military budget, adjusted for inflation, now approaches the peak levels we saw during the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan back in the early 2010s.
That's just profound inefficiency, isn't it? We're paying peak global war prices when we're supposedly focused on great power competition now. So where's all that money going, if not to, active combat deployment?
Well, a lot of it is being funneled through these sources called budget pathologies. The most famous or, infamous example is the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, the OCO fund. This was initially set up after 9/11, meant to pay for unforeseen combat costs, emergency spending.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, kind of appalling when you look at the numbers. Since September 11, 2001, the Department of Defense has received, get this, a shocking $2 trillion in OCO funding.
$2 trillion?
Yeah. To put that scale in context, that $2 trillion is roughly the entire annual GDP of a country like Canada or Italy. And that money basically disappeared through a loophole.
Exactly. It's a loophole because the OCO budget was specifically exempted from the spending caps, the one set up by the 2011 Budget Control Act, the BCA. Remember, the BCA was supposed to instill some basic fiscal discipline across the government.
Right. But the OCO fund let elected officials just bypass those caps entirely. Our sources argue this meant officials could publicly, quote, feign concern about out-of-control federal spending without doing anything to stop it, while they were still funding projects and programs that had, well, absolutely nothing to do with overseas combat anymore.
It's financial games layered on top of strategic distraction.
Yeah.
And the cost is now driving the annual federal deficit to dangerously high levels.
Exactly. Real security comes through prudence, not just overwhelming force or throwing money around. Policymakers have to recognize that resource constraints are real. The debt itself is a threat. I mean, just look at the numbers. The annual federal deficit, it fell to about $438 billion after the BCA kicked in back in 2015. But by the end of fiscal year 2019, it had already soared past $984 billion.
Wow.
That kind of runaway spending is fiscally unsustainable, and it's strategically distracting us from threats that demand immediate focused resources. We are, in effect, financing our own decline.
Okay, so that financial burden, it basically forces a strategic recalculation.
Yeah.
And the new defense strategy that's outlined in these reports, it's making a dramatic shift. And frankly, it seems about time. It's prioritizing robust homeland defense over that traditional global dominance and intervention model. And this pivot, it's being driven by acute security failures happening right now inside our own borders. Yeah, we really have to acknowledge the immediate, almost visceral nature of these threats. Our sources argue pretty strongly that our borders are now effectively overrun. Overrun by massive, uncontrolled flows of migrants, yes, but also narcotics. And crucially, the flow of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids over the southern border. It's directly responsible for tens of thousands of American deaths every single year.
Tens of thousands.
The fact that an external supply chain is causing such massive domestic casualties makes this a critical national security threat. It really demands a military-level response, according to these analyses.
And the threat assessment goes beyond just the drugs, right? U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, they've encountered tens of thousands of Chinese nationals along the southern border. That's a really sharp uptick from prior years. And congressional officials cited in our research, they express deep concern about the potential ties these individuals might have to the Chinese government and the alarming possibility of, espionage or even sabotage on U.S. soil. We just can't ignore that kind of vulnerability when China is explicitly named as our primary adversary.
So, given these really acute domestic security gaps, protecting the homeland requires the Department of Defense to actively support border security efforts. And this isn't some new radical idea. The military actually has a long history of defending our nation's frontiers. In today's context, that support means things like providing broad area surveillance, maritime interdiction, helping build counter-narcotics capacity, intelligence collection, and even the potential for direct action against high-value targets operating within the Americas.
Okay, but why the big pivot now? What's the strategic imperative?
Well, the mandate seems pretty clear from these sources. We have to concentrate forces where they are needed most, which means at home and in our immediate sphere of influence. If we continue to spread our assets thin all over the globe, China, our biggest foreign threat, is poised to achieve hegemony in the Indo-Pacific.
And that's a region accounting for, what, 60% of global GDP?
Exactly. So continuing to allow ourselves to be strategically distracted abroad basically ensures China's success over there. But having this chronic vulnerability at home ensures their long-term strategic victory over us. It's a two-front problem caused by distraction.
Okay, so that brings us to the Western Hemisphere focus. It's urgent, you're saying, not theoretical, because China is already here.
They are. They're cementing their influence through really calculated soft power, economic leverage.
Yeah.
And they're doing it right in the maritime approaches to our southern border. It's quite deliberate.
And that leverage, it's profoundly physical and strategic, based on what these reports say. Our sources detail that China currently owns or operates more than 40 ports in Mexico, Central, and South America. Yeah, and we're not talking about small docks. These include deep water ports. Ports big enough for the People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan to make critical logistics calls. This isn't just commerce anymore. This looks like strategic positioning for military projection.
Right, and what's fascinating here is the multi-layered benefit China gets from this. These investments, they cement access to vital resources, sure, but they also help capture elites, gain significant leverage over local governments, and, most worryingly, they enable the projection of military power right into the Western Hemisphere. They gain the capability, potentially, to restrict or even block access to these ports in a crisis.
Which could severely hinder the passage of American naval vessels?
Precisely.
Let me push back slightly on that, though. If they're commercial ports, how quickly could China actually militarize 40 holdings scattered around in a crisis? Is that realistic?
Well, they don't necessarily need to be fully militarized in the conventional sense, not right away. They might only need to restrict access or just leverage the technological aspects of their control. We know these Chinese-operated ports, for example, facilitate the shipment of fentanyl precursors towards the United States.
Okay.
They can exploit the technology and the access to data they gain for intelligence advantages. They can potentially cause delays or disruption to U.S. maritime transport systems if there was a conflict overseas, say in the Pacific. It directly connects our trade dependency to our domestic drug crisis and our military logistics vulnerability. It's all intertwined.
And yet, even as this threat is growing, some current U.S. policies seem to be creating a vacuum for them to fill. You look at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, it operates on less than 1% of the federal budget. Tiny amount. But it's seen as a vital, really cost-effective tool for countering China's economic influence globally. So the argument in some of these sources is that removing U.S. foreign aid, it won't save significant money, but it will create a soft power vacuum that the PRC will happily fill with their own resources.
Effectively handing a diplomatic and strategic gift to our biggest adversaries.
Yeah. It seems we can't afford to retreat from this sphere of influence when our primary adversary is advancing so aggressively right here.
Okay, so we've established the U.S. spends enormous sums on defense, often wastefully, through these funding loopholes. But the second part of the fiscal problem is whether that spending is actually smart, even when it's legitimate. Our sources contend the budget heavily prioritizes expensive, aging legacy systems over true forward-looking innovation and readiness. And that results in, well, catastrophic inefficiency sometimes.
Right. We're paying top dollar for capability that either isn't there or it's decades delayed. I mean, look at the poster child for modern military procurement failure, the F-35 Lightning II aircraft program. It was meant to replace multiple older aircraft types. It's expected to be delivered nearly a decade late and at an inflation-adjusted cost way, way above the original estimates.
And the problem feels systematic. Consider the Navy's newest, most capable warship, the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier. This ship had serious setbacks upon delivery. By late 2019, reports showed only 4 of its 11 advanced weapons elevators were actually operational.
Wait, only 4 out of 11 elevators. If the elevators aren't working, what does that mean in real combat terms?
It means you can't get the bombs and missiles from the magazine down below up to the flight deck quickly enough to sustain a high-tempo fight.
So the ship can't fight effectively.
You're paying billions for a state-of-the-art carrier that potentially cannot perform its primary function under pressure. Because the underlying innovative technologies, the very things that made it expensive, failed to meet expectations on delivery. We are paying top dollar for systems that might be functionally incapable of engaging in a modern great power conflict.
Okay, so the solution isn't just spending less, it's spending smarter on things that actually matter in a potential fight against a sophisticated peer like China. This means the military needs urgent, maybe even cold-eyed prioritization.
Precisely. The Army, for instance, should immediately divest from outdated heavy weapon systems, things like the Abrams tank, which were designed for yesterday's ground wars in Europe or the Middle East. Instead, they must focus resources on long-range precision fires.
Okay, explain that concept, long-range precision fires.
We're talking about advanced modern artillery and missile systems, stuff that can hit targets accurately from hundreds of miles away. This enables the U.S. to hold an adversary at risk, maybe prevent an invasion force from landing, without needing a massive ground presence right up front.
So the future force has to be technologically proficient, agile.
Relying on new layers of sensors, radar, sonar, satellites to direct those long-range attacks, or controlling vast networks of unmanned vehicles, drones in the air, on the sea, under the sea, not just buying more and more expensive manned planes and ships.
Right.
And this technological emphasis, it leads to a critical shift in strategic doctrine. The sources call it deterrence by denial.
Deterrence by denial. Okay.
Yeah. Instead of relying only on traditional nuclear threats, the implicit promise of massive nuclear punishment if we're attacked, but we shift towards denial. This means making aggressive action by an adversary too costly and too difficult from the start. We leverage our advantages in sensors and long-range conventional strike capability. We basically make the coastline, or whatever area we're defending, so dense with detection and missile capability that an invasion force simply can't survive the attempt. We deny them victory from the outset, conventionally.
That sounds like a powerful way to use fiscal discipline to actually force strategic clarity. Spend smart, not just big.
It is. And if we connect all this back to the bigger picture, the path to national security, according to these analyses, seems clear. Shed the financial and strategic burdens of trying to be the world's sole police force. Focus our finite resources on securing the homeland, especially stabilizing the border situation, and modernize our military with clear, effective priorities designed specifically to deter our primary competitor, China.
And we've seen, particularly in the Western Hemisphere piece, that China thinks in terms of generations, not just election cycles. They're making these long-term strategic moves, cementing influence, gaining military access right in our backyard. The pivot demanded by these sources really feels like one of, well, survival.
Which brings us to maybe the final difficult question. Given that the U.S. government tends to focus relentlessly on short-term political wins, often defined by a 2-year budget cycle or a 4-year election cycle, what specific sustained actions can citizens actually demand to ensure our leaders adopt something closer to China's long-range view? Maybe not a 100-year strategy, but something longer term, to actually secure America's future. The real question might be whether our democratic system is even capable of making those kinds of painful, long-term choices right now.